Grüß, willkommen in einem and in einer Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 8 of my organisational series. In this video I'll look at the estimated combat strengths of the armies which fought in 1800. For this analysis I'll be looking at the two main battles which occurred in 1800, starting with the Battle of Marengo in June. The classic method of determining the combat strengths of opposing forces is to use the number of infantry, cavalry and artillery. This does give us a view of the comparative strength, but it does not take into account the specific troop qualities and types. After all, it's a lot more expensive to field a cuirassier rather than a fusilier, for example. I would have to assume some level of combat effectiveness difference must exist between these two troop types. I have created a number of videos comparing the strengths of World War II and Cold War formations using a points system from a set of figure gaming rules. While this system is almost certainly not empirically foolproof, it does give us an idea of the difference in strengths of opposing formations based on troop types and qualities. For this video I'll be using a very simple point system, but it would be possible to use a more complex point system for a more complex set of rules if you so desire. I went for a very simple system as it averages out a lot of detail, and that detail I simply do not possess. While we have some data on the various orders of battles, it's not as accurate as, let's say, World War II or Cold War, which in itself is subject to a significant margin of error. As my objective in this video is to look at an entire battle, I will look at each army by breaking up the level of command just below the army headquarters, which for the French is the rather early small corps system or formation. When we move over to the Austrian army, the situation is a bit more difficult, so I'll be going down to the wing level, which does give us a rather unequal breakdown of the army, but it's what I have. This is what the strength would look like in a graphical form using a point system. The first point to note is I can understand why Napoleon had such a difficult time at Marengo when I look at this. Napoleon was a master of concentrating the maximum force against an enemy which lacked its maximum force. In this case, Napoleon was clearly outmaneuvered and found himself outnumbered, which does explain the initial loss. On the other hand, the recovery was impressive and does indicate the French had a command or leadership force multiplier over the Austrians at an operational and tactical level. The other interesting point was the lopsided nature of the Austrian army, with the centre comprising of well over 50% of the combat strength of the entire army. This may well have been a factor in the slow deployment of the Austrian attack, which, if it was launched more effectively, may well have swept the French forces from the field. On the other hand, it took a similar time for the French to form up an attack at Wagram, so maybe that's simply the time it's required to form up a column into an attack formation and launch an attack. Based on this points-centric analysis, command was clearly a critical factor, as the French had lost the first part of the battle and its ability to recover was what secured its victory. This was clearly due to some level of superior command, possibly even morale. The other factor was the superior corps level command structure which the French possessed, which, while outnumbered, did manage to hold the Austrians back. I'm uncertain if tactically the French were superior in this battle. I suspect some formations may well have been, but I also suspect in this case command was the critical factor, not the combat effectiveness of the initial or the individual soldiers. Let's now move over to the Battle of Hohenlinden, which occurred in December in 1800. Hohenlinden was a much larger battle. This shows the entire French force. However, in this case, one of the wings, the right wing, was not available during the battle. The Austrians were organised into four main columns, which, surprise, surprise, advanced in four columns. Two were on good roads and two on poor roads, which did have a major impact on how the battle unfolded. Once we removed the French right wing, which was not available in the battle, both forces were very evenly matched. The flow and the result of the battle was very much a result of the Austrians being surprised at the French defending and a brilliant outflanking manoeuvre on the French right flank. The piecemeal engagement of the Austrians also assisted in their defeat. Due to the large size of the French army, it was also organised into wings. However, below the wing structure it did use the early small corps structure, similar in many ways to the French army at Marengo. On the Austrian side, two of the largest columns did engage the French quickly, as they were travelling on good quality roads. This was critical as the weather was poor, leaving many roads very muddy, particularly the poor quality roads. Apart from being surprised by the French, the other major issue the Austrians faced was the two smaller columns arrived very late and in both cases formed small units which were easily brushed aside by the French, more concentrated posture. This was clearly a command failure on the Austrian side, as well as a single commander displaying an extraordinary level of initiative on the French side, which allowed the French to outflank the Austrians. Once again, I feel we can say there was a definite difference in command at strategic level, with the Austrians being strategically surprised. The other interesting point was the impressive local initiative of some of the French commanders, which was generally lacking or inferior on the Austrian side. When all factors were equal, the Austrian infantry were evenly matched, but too often they were placed in an impossible position and suffered accordingly. Let's now move on to 1805, specifically the series of battles which resulted in the Austrian disaster at Ulm in mid-October. The armies had grown a lot in these short 5 years, as can be seen by the size of the French army. The Austrian army, shown here in its totality, was equally huge. Although it should be noted this does include the army of Italy, which will be removed from our strength comparison of Ulm because it wasn't involved in the Battle of Ulm. The first interesting point is both forces seem very evenly matched. However, the Austrians were more scattered. The Tyrolean column was not involved for most of the critical parts of the campaign, or battle, and many other columns were spending most of their time advancing west to only then reverse back. Most of the fighting was performed by only a single column before the Austrians found themselves surrounded. The French had also adopted their new corps structure, with each corps being strong enough to hold out against a larger force if required. The Austrians adopted the column structure, and on the surface this appeared very similar to the corps structure. However, the subordinate formations within each column were often unfamiliar with each other, and with the exception of the Tyrolean column, and perhaps the other smaller columns, coordination was lacking when compared with the French. Considering the outcome and the theoretical force mixes, this is a clear example of superior strategic command as well as superior operational command. The interesting point about this campaign was the poor showing of the Austrians when they did attempt to counterattack. This could indicate the French infantry in particular were becoming to achieve superiority over the Austrians, which they may not have possessed in 1800. Let's now move forward to the Battle of Caldirio, which occurred in late October 1805. The Battle of Caldirio is of most interest to me due to the differences in the strengths of both sides. In this battle, the French maintained something closer to their old column structure as well. The Austrian army, as was their pattern or their normal procedure, was organised into wings. Once we strip away the forces which are not involved in the battle, we can see the opposing forces were reasonably equal. What I find interesting is the Austrians possessed significantly more forces which were not engaged. It seems like this is an example of Austrian formations wandering around unengaged, while other formations are forced to fight at a disadvantage. This is clearly a doctrinal issue. While both forces were evenly matched, the French managed to force the Austrians back. I suspect part of this was due to Charles wishing to fall back to Vienna after hearing of Mac's surrender, but with the forces available, you would have thought Charles would have had the ability to engage the French and defeat them before he pulled back. On the other hand, Charles may have realised the victory in Italy was not going to make up for a loss in Germany and withdrew to try and save the situation. Now we come to the decisive Battle of Austerlitz, which occurred in December 1805. In terms of strength, the French had been reduced significantly, possibly due to losses and the requirements of garrisoning conquered territory. The Allied army had a significant advantage in terms of raw strength over the French, thanks to the Russians. Looking at this comparison of forces, we can now see why Austerlitz was such a brilliant victory for Napoleon. The French should have lost this, yet they managed to shatter the Allied army. One factor was the excellent performance of the French right flank, which managed to hold off against heavy attacks. I suspect by 1805 the French infantry had achieved a moderate level of superiority over the Austrian infantry at least. However, putting that to one side, it's clearly the main reason for the French victory was the leadership of Napoleon. Outnumbered, he managed to surprise, cut through and surround half the Allied army. I tend to view this battle as Napoleon's pinnacle, and it was an astounding achievement. And so we come to an end of episode 8 of my organisational video series, in this case looking at the strengths of the armies which fought in 1800 and 1805 using a simple point system which allows me to differentiate between cuirassiers and fusiliers, which quite clearly had a different combat capability. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.